The wedding hadn't started yet. The guests were still arriving, still laughing, still adjusting their ties, when the first woman unfolded the paper she found on her seat and went completely silent. Then the woman beside her. Then the man in the third row. One by one, the laughter stopped. At the front of the room, the chairman stood at the altar, watching his guests read something he couldn't see. Why was nobody looking at him anymore? Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. The venue had cost more than most people earn in a year. White orchids lined every aisle. The chandeliers were imported. The chairs were gilded, each one positioned with precision by a team that had spent 3 days getting the angles right. Chairman Richard Hale had approved every detail personally, because that's what Richard Hale did. He controlled things. He had been controlling things for 37 years, and he was very good at it. The wedding was supposed to start at 2 o'clock. At 1:45, the coordinator found the letters. Her name was Sophie, and she had managed 43 events at this venue. She had seen cake disasters, runaway grooms, a fistfight between two uncles during cocktail hour. She was not easily rattled. But when she picked up the small folded paper from the nearest chair, thinking it was a forgotten program, maybe a receipt, and read what was inside, she stood still for a very long time. Then she looked at the chair beside it. Same paper. Same handwriting. She walked to the third chair. Same paper. She stood in the middle of the aisle and looked down the rows stretching out in front of her. 84 chairs. A letter on every single one. Sophie read the note in her hand one more time. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and went to stand near the entrance. She did not call the coordinator's desk. She did not alert security. She did not tell Richard Hale. She just waited. Because she genuinely did not know what the right thing to do was. And by the time she decided, it was already too late. The guests arrived at 1:50. The first few picked up their letters the way you'd pick up a menu, casually, without thinking. One woman opened hers while still talking to the man beside her. She stopped talking mid-sentence. The man noticed, took his own letter, and opened it. His expression shifted like something had moved underneath his face. Within 4 minutes, the room had fractured. Small clusters formed in the aisles. 2 women near the back moved toward the exit, whispering. A man in the fourth row simply sat holding his letter with both hands, not reading anymore, just holding it. A young couple near the middle exchanged a look, then looked toward the front of the room. Richard Hale was standing near the altar with his best man. He was laughing at something when he noticed it, the silence arriving in waves, moving toward him from the back of the room like weather. He stopped laughing. He looked at his fiancée, Catherine, who had just entered from a side door in a dress that must have taken months to make. She was looking at the guests. Her expression was careful and very still. Richard looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke. It was Harlan who walked up to him. Harlan Moore. 61 years old. 30 years on Richard's board. The man who had been Richard's closest friend since they were both young and broke and certain they would not stay that way. Harlan walked through the fractured room with the calm, deliberate movement of someone who had decided something. He stopped in front of Richard and held out a single folded piece of paper. "You need to read this," he said. "Just that. Nothing else." Richard looked at the paper. He looked at Harlan's face. Then he took it. He read it slowly. His expression did not change. Not the eyes, not the jaw, not the set of his mouth. 37 years of boardrooms had taught him how to receive bad news without letting anyone see it land. He read to the end. He folded the paper once. Then again. His hand kept folding it, smaller, tighter, long after there was nothing left to fold. The wedding did not start at 2 o'clock. At 2:15, Sophie quietly began asking guests if they would like water or coffee in the lobby. Nobody argued. The room emptied in less than 10 minutes, the way rooms do when everyone understands, without being told, that something irreversible has just happened. Catherine did not go to the lobby. She stood at the side door and watched Richard standing alone at the altar. He still had the folded paper in his hand. He was looking at nothing in particular. She did not go to him. He did not call her name. Daniel Hale found his letter near the back. He was 31, Richard's son from his first marriage. He had come alone, which people had found mildly strange but hadn't mentioned. He spotted the paper on his chair while the room was still filling up, before the silence had reached the back rows. He picked it up. He read it. And his face did not do what everyone else's face had done. There was no shock. No confusion. No slow horror spreading from the eyes down. There was something else. Something quieter and much older than surprise. Something that looked almost like grief, not for something just discovered, but for something he had been carrying for a long time and had hoped, maybe, he wouldn't have to put down here. Not like this. He folded the letter. He put it in his jacket pocket, directly over his chest. He looked at his father standing alone at the front of the emptying room. And he didn't move. Because Daniel Hale already knew something. The question is, what did he know? And how long had he been keeping it? If this story is already pulling at something in you, you're not alone. Drop a comment and let us know what you're thinking so far. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there when the next chapter drops. This one is only getting deeper. Nobody called it off officially. There was no announcement, no apology over a microphone. The wedding simply stopped existing, the way a conversation stops when someone says something that can't be unsaid. The guests drifted to the lobby. Staff collected glasses. Catherine stood in a corridor alone, still in her dress, and Richard Hale went somewhere no one followed him. But before we get to what happened next, we need to understand who Richard Hale actually was. Because the man standing at that altar was not built overnight. And the letters on those chairs didn't come from nowhere. 22 years ago, Richard Hale was no one. That's not an exaggeration. He was 34, working out of a two-room office above a dry cleaner, pitching investors who mostly didn't call back. He had a second-hand suit and a very good handshake and one person who believed in him without conditions. Her name was Lena. Lena Hale, née Vasquez. She was a primary school teacher when they met. Quiet, careful with people, the kind of woman who remembered what you told her 3 months ago and asked about it unprompted. She married Richard when he had nothing, which meant she had made a bet, on him, on what he might become. She was not wrong about what he became. She was just wrong about what it would cost her. The empire came fast once it started. The first company. The first acquisition. The board members who had ignored his calls suddenly returning them. Richard worked 18-hour days, and Lena covered the rest, the home, their son Daniel, the dinner she cooked alone and put in the refrigerator because she knew he wouldn't be back until the house was dark. She didn't complain. That was the thing people who knew her always said afterward. She didn't complain. What she did was wait. And then, at a certain point, she stopped waiting. Not loudly. Lena did nothing loudly. She just quietly accepted that the man she had married was no longer available in the ways that mattered, and she found a way to live inside that fact. Richard, for his part, found a different solution. By the time Daniel was 9 years old, the marriage was over in every way except the paperwork. The paperwork came 3 years later. Richard signed it in a boardroom between 2 other meetings, which told you everything you needed to know about the weight he gave it. Lena got the house and a financial settlement that was generous by the standards of the law and insulting by the standards of what she had actually given. She didn't fight it. She took Daniel to a smaller house in a quieter part of the city and she kept teaching, and she did not speak about Richard Hale in public for the rest of her life. Richard funded her funeral 4 years ago. He did not attend. The official reason was a conflict, a shareholders' meeting in another country, immovable, deeply unfortunate. Everyone accepted this explanation the way people accept explanations that let them avoid an uncomfortable truth. Daniel was 27 at the time. He stood at his mother's grave in the rain with 23 people who had loved her, and his father was not one of them. Daniel has never brought it up. He has never had to. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be permanently understood. Now Daniel was sitting in a lobby chair outside the venue's main hall, still in his wedding guest suit, his jacket folded over his knee. He hadn't taken the letter out again. He didn't need to. He had read it enough times already. 2 women from the guest list walked past him murmuring about Richard. One of them said something about not being surprised. The other one shushed her. Daniel looked at the floor. There was one thing about Lena that most people didn't know, not because it was hidden exactly, but because it had simply drifted out of memory the way small family facts do when there's no one left to repeat them. Lena had a younger sister. Her name was Elena. 7 years younger than Lena, sharp in the way Lena was quiet, the kind of person who said what she thought before she'd finished thinking it all the way through. Elena had been present in Daniel's early childhood, birthday parties, Sunday dinners, the occasional weekend she spent at the house when things were still good. And then, around the time of the divorce, Elena was gone. Not dead. Just absent. No explanation that Daniel was ever given. He had asked his mother once, when he was maybe 12. Lena had looked at him with an expression he didn't have a name for at that age. She needed some distance, was all she said. Daniel had accepted that. Children accept things because they have no alternative. But he was 31 now, and standing in the wreckage of his father's second wedding, and the letter in his jacket pocket had arrived knowing things that only a very small number of people could have known. He pressed his hand against his jacket pocket. He could feel the shape of the folded paper through the fabric. He did not take it out. It was one of the older guests who said it, a woman named Patricia, who had known Richard since his first company, who had attended Lena's funeral and remembered every face there. She was standing near the window with two other women, her letter still in her hand, held loosely like she'd forgotten she was holding it. "This handwriting," she said. She said it quietly, almost to herself. The woman beside her glanced over. "What about it?" Patricia looked at the letter again. Tilted it slightly, like changing the angle would change what she was seeing. "It looks like Lena's," she said. The lobby went a shade quieter. Not loudly. Just, a degree of stillness settled into the air around those three women that hadn't been there a moment before. "That's not possible," the second woman said. "No," Patricia agreed. "It's not." But she didn't put the letter down. And across the lobby, Daniel Hale, who had not appeared to be listening, who had not moved or looked up, slowly pressed his hand harder against his jacket pocket. Like he was trying to keep something inside it from getting out. If you're already asking questions, you're exactly where this story wants you. Leave your theories in the comments, we read them. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there when Chapter 3 drops. The handwriting is just the beginning. The venue had security cameras in every corridor. 12 of them. Richard's team found this out when they asked the venue manager to pull the footage, and the manager, who had spent the last 2 hours managing a collapsing wedding and 60 confused guests, sat down at a monitor and found exactly what they were looking for within 4 minutes. There she was. 1 hour before the first guest arrived. The main hall, empty, chairs still perfectly arranged. A young woman walked in through the service entrance carrying nothing visible, no bag large enough for 84 envelopes, no trolley, no box. Just a dark coat and steady hands and the kind of pace that didn't belong to someone nervous. She moved down the first row and placed a letter on the seat. Then the next. Then the next. She didn't rush. She didn't check the door. She didn't look up at the cameras, not because she missed them, but because she had clearly already decided she didn't care about them. She worked row by row, the way someone works when they've rehearsed a thing until it stops feeling significant. When she finished, she walked back toward the service entrance the same way she came in. Unhurried. Like she had simply done a task and now the task was done. She was gone in 11 minutes. The venue manager paused the footage on the clearest frame of her face. Richard stood behind him and said nothing for a long moment. "She's not on any guest list," the manager said. "I know," Richard said. "Did anyone stop her?" Richard didn't answer that. Because the answer was no, and the reason was obvious, she had moved through that room like she had every right to be in it. The staff had seen her and registered her as someone who belonged, the way you register a person in a uniform or carrying a clipboard. She had given them nothing to question. That wasn't luck. That was practice. By the time the footage was found, most of the letters were already gone, collected by Sophie and 2 other staff members who had quietly moved through the lobby pulling them from hands and pockets with apologies and murmured explanations about a misunderstanding. They got most of them. Not all of them. 3 guests had already taken photographs. One of those photographs had been sent to 4 other people before anyone thought to ask for discretion. By evening it had traveled further than that, passed between people who had not been at the wedding but knew someone who had, the way things move when they contain the exact right combination of wealth and scandal and unanswered questions. The photograph showed the bottom third of the letter. Most of the text was cut off. But the last line was clear. "Ask him what happened to the child he chose not to find." That was the line. That was what the whole room had read and gone quiet over. Not an accusation. Not a name. Not a demand. Just a question, and the specific cruelty of it was the word chose. Not the child he didn't know about. Not the child he lost. The child he chose not to find. That single word did more damage than a paragraph could have. Catherine found the photograph on someone's phone. She didn't ask whose. She read the line once, handed the phone back, and went to find Richard. He was in a small side room off the main corridor, jacket off, sitting in a chair that was too decorative to be comfortable. He looked like a man who had been very powerful for a very long time and was currently unsure what that was worth. Catherine came in and closed the door. She stood across from him. She didn't sit. "Is there a child?" she said. Just that. Clean and direct, the way Catherine did most things. Richard looked at her. And here is what the audience needed to understand: his face in that moment was not the face of a man caught. It was the face of a man genuinely searching his own history for something he might have missed, like a person patting their pockets for keys they're not sure they ever had. "No," he said. Catherine held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone satisfied. The nod of someone who has received an answer and now has to decide, privately, what to do with it. She left without another word. And the audience was left with the same question she was: did Richard Hale just lie to her? Or does he actually not know? Both answers were possible. And somehow, both answers were almost equally bad. The guests were gone by 5 o'clock. The flowers were still there. The gilded chairs, still arranged in their perfect rows, letters gone now but the shape of the day still hanging in the air. Daniel sat in his car in the parking structure one level below the venue. He had been sitting there for 40 minutes. He hadn't started the engine. He took out his phone. He found a number and held his thumb over it for a moment. Then he called. It rang twice. She came, Daniel said. A pause on the other end. Not surprise, something more like the exhale of someone who had been waiting for a particular piece of news and has now received it. I know, the voice said. It was a woman's voice. Older. Steady. How do you know? Daniel asked. Because I taught her to write like that. Daniel closed his eyes. Outside the car, somewhere above him, the venue was being quietly dismantled, flowers boxed, chairs stacked, the evidence of a wedding that never happened disappearing piece by piece. She wasn't supposed to do it this way, Daniel said. No, the woman said. She wasn't. Another pause. Is she safe? Daniel asked. The woman didn't answer immediately. Which was, in its own way, an answer. Daniel pressed his hand flat against the steering wheel. He stared at the concrete wall in front of him. Somewhere out there was a young woman in a dark coat who had walked into a room full of powerful people and changed everything, and then walked back out like it was nothing. A woman who wrote in a hand that an older guest had instantly recognized as Lena's, because someone had taught her that way. Someone who knew Lena. Someone who had been close enough to absorb the smallest details of how she moved through the world. And Daniel knew who that someone was. The question was whether Richard Hale would ever get to know too. That last line is sitting heavy, we know. Drop your theories in the comments, because this story is going exactly where you're not expecting. Subscribe and turn on notifications so Chapter 4 finds you the moment it's out. Richard Hale did not fall apart. That was the thing about him, even when the ground was moving, he looked for solid footing and found it fast. By the morning after the wedding, he had already made 3 calls. The florist was paid for the full arrangement. The venue received a settlement for the disruption. And a private investigator named Gerald Marsh received a file containing 1 security camera still, 1 physical description, and a very clear instruction: find her. Gerald was good at his job. He came back in 48 hours. He came back with 3 names. Richard sat across from Gerald in his home office, not the corporate one, the private one, the room that no assistant had a key to. Gerald laid a folder on the desk. Inside were 3 photographs, 3 files, 3 women in their early 20s, each with a documented connection to Lena's family. Each one a possibility. Each one, separately, capable of being the answer. Richard looked at the first photograph for a long time. Which one? He said. I can't tell you that yet, Gerald said. That's what I'm telling you, it could be any of them. Richard closed the folder. He put his hand flat on top of it, the way a person covers something they're not ready to open again. Then he slid it toward himself and said, keep going. The first woman was 23. Her name was listed as Vera Okafor, but that was her adoptive family's name. Her original birth records were sealed, the PI noted, at the specific request of an unnamed third party, around the time Lena and Richard's divorce was finalized. The timing was not a coincidence. It was too clean to be a coincidence. The adoption had gone through a private agency that no longer operated, dissolved quietly 8 years after the placement. A sealed file. A dissolved agency. A third party no one could name. Richard wrote nothing down. He just listened. The second woman was harder to explain. Her name was Sophia Reyes. She had no known connection to Lena's family by blood, but she had vanished from public records 8 years ago, at the age of 15. The last address on file for her was connected to Elena Vasquez. Lena's younger sister. The one nobody talked about. Richard went very still when Gerald said that name. Elena, he said. You know her? A pause. I knew of her. That was all he said. Gerald waited. Richard didn't add anything. So Gerald moved on. The third woman was the one that unsettled Richard most, not because she was the most likely answer, but because of what her file contained. Her name was Clara Marsh, no relation to the PI, just an unlucky coincidence of surnames. 22 years old. Currently living in the city, working at a small design firm. Ordinary life, ordinary history. Nothing flagged. Except one thing. 18 years ago, the Hale Charitable Foundation had made an anonymous donation to the primary school she attended at the time. A significant one. Enough to fund a new classroom wing. The donation was listed as anonymous in the public records, but the foundation's internal logs, which Richard had pulled himself that morning, without telling anyone, showed an authorization code that did not match any of his known sign-offs. Someone had approved that donation using a code that should not have existed. Richard had built the foundation. He had approved every major gift for the first decade of its existence. He did not recognize the authorization code. He did not recognize the name of the staff member listed beside it. When he called the foundation's director to ask, the director went quiet and then said, carefully, that the records from that period had been archived and he would need some time to find the relevant documentation. He still hadn't called back. Someone inside Richard's own organization had quietly directed money toward a little girl's school 18 years ago. And Richard Hale had never known. What Richard didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Catherine had already started her own search. She hadn't confronted him again after that side room conversation. She hadn't called. She had gone home, changed out of the wedding dress, folded it without ceremony over a chair, and opened her laptop. She was methodical by nature. She had been a corporate lawyer for 11 years before she met Richard, and old habits don't dissolve because you fall in love with someone. She found the circulated photograph of the letter within an hour. She had the text of the final line memorized in 2 readings. She started building a timeline: Richard's marriage to Lena, the divorce, the years in between, cross-referencing public records, old news coverage, foundation filings. She didn't call Richard. She didn't tell him what she was doing. And when his lawyers sent a formal request to both guests who had refused to delete the photographs, framing it as a privacy matter, threatening civil action, Catherine heard about it through a mutual contact and sat for a long time looking at nothing. She had asked him if there was a child. He had said no. And now his lawyers were working to erase the one piece of evidence that asked the same question. She thought about that for a while. Then she kept working. Richard's legal team did not get the photographs. Both guests held firm. One of them, a retired judge named Franklin Cole, sent back a single-paragraph response that was so precisely worded it functioned as its own kind of warning. The legal standoff settled into an uneasy silence that both sides understood could not last. The photograph stayed in circulation. The question inside it stayed alive. Ask him what happened to the child he chose not to find. That evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the letter in front of him. The one from his chair at the wedding. He had read it so many times by now that he didn't need to read it again. He could recite every word without looking. He read it again anyway. Then he reached into his jacket, the same jacket he'd worn to the wedding, still hanging over the back of the chair because he hadn't dealt with it yet, and he found the second pocket. The inside one, the narrow one behind the lining that most people forget exists. He took out a second letter. Same paper. Same handwriting. Same careful, deliberate strokes that Patricia had recognized and then tried not to recognize. But this letter was different. This one was not the same as the letter on the chairs. This one was addressed to him specifically, his name at the top, nothing else. No general audience. No public accusation. Just Daniel. He smoothed it out on the table next to the first one. 2 letters. 2 different messages. One for a room full of people who barely knew her name. One for the only person at that wedding she had apparently decided to trust. The audience never got to read what the second letter said. But Daniel's face, as he sat looking at both of them side by side, said enough. 2 letters. The same handwriting. And only Daniel knows what the second one says. Tell us in the comments, what do you think she wrote to him specifically? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there when Chapter 5 drops. This story is nowhere near finished. Gerald Marsh called Richard on a Tuesday morning with the kind of voice that means the search is over. It's the sealed adoption, Gerald said. It has to be. The timing, the family connection, the dissolved agency, it all lines up. Her name is Clara. Clara Voss. 23 years old. She's been living in the city for the past 2 years. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then, can you get me a meeting? Already working on it, Gerald said. Clara agreed to meet within 24 hours. That was the first thing that should have felt strange, but it didn't, not yet. Richard was a man people generally responded to quickly, whether out of respect or fear or curiosity. So when Gerald reported back that Clara had said yes without hesitation, Richard took it as confirmation. Of course she agreed. She had spent years building toward this moment. Why would she say no? They met in a neutral space, a private room in a hotel neither of them used regularly. Richard arrived first. Clara arrived exactly on time, which told him she had been waiting nearby. She was 23. Dark coat. Composed in the way that young people are composed when they have practiced being composed, a stillness that costs something to maintain. She sat down across from Richard and put a folder on the table between them. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. I wasn't sure either, Richard said. Which was honest. Clara's story came out in pieces, the way prepared stories always do, not quite flowing, but not quite stuttering either. The careful middle pace of someone who has rehearsed without memorizing word for word. She had been placed with an adoptive family, the Voss family, when she was less than a year old. She grew up not knowing who her biological parents were. That was standard. Her adoptive parents had told her, a closed adoption, sealed records, nothing to pursue. She had accepted that for most of her life. Then, 3 years ago, she had found something. A letter among her adoptive mother's belongings. Her adoptive mother had passed, a small inheritance, the sorting of a life into boxes. Inside one of those boxes, tucked inside a book of pressed flowers, was an envelope. Inside the envelope was a single page. She didn't tell Richard what the page said. She just said it had a name on it. His name. She pushed the folder toward him. Inside were copies, a birth record, a letter, a photograph of Lena that Richard recognized immediately. Lena at maybe 30 years old, standing in front of a window, not looking at the camera. The kind of photograph you take of someone who doesn't know they're being photographed. I wrote the letters, Clara said. I wanted you to know I existed. I wanted the people around you to know. She paused. I wanted it to cost you something. Even a small something. Richard looked at the photograph of Lena for a long time. Then he said, quietly, I'll agree to a DNA test. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say she was wrong. He didn't say anything that would later be used against him. But he didn't deny her either, and for a man who had spent 37 years denying things, that silence was its own kind of answer. Clara nodded. She picked up her folder. She stood. I'll wait to hear from your lawyers, she said. She left. Richard sat alone in the neutral room for 11 minutes before he called anyone. Catherine heard about Clara through Gerald, not through Richard. That was the detail that settled something in her, the way a key turns and you hear the lock engage. She called Richard once. He answered. You should have told me, she said. I didn't know if it was real yet. That's not what I meant, Catherine said. A long pause. I know, Richard said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand an explanation or issue an ultimatum. She simply said she needed time, and they both understood that time was the polite word for something more permanent. She ended the call. She took off the engagement ring, not dramatically, just sat at her kitchen table and slid it off and placed it next to her coffee cup, and she went back to work. Richard did not call her again that day. The story spread the way stories spread when they involve a billionaire and a secret daughter and a collapsed wedding. Within 48 hours, Clara's name was in 3 separate gossip columns, none of them naming her directly but all of them describing her with enough specificity that anyone who knew could confirm it. Sources close to the family said the chairman had acknowledged the possibility. Sources close to the investigation said a DNA test had been arranged. The public exhaled. The mystery had a face now. It had a name. It had documents and a folder and a hotel room meeting and a woman who had said, plainly, I wrote the letters. Case closed, people said in the comments and the group chats. Sad, but not surprising. Rich man, hidden child, broken family. We've seen this before. Daniel heard about Clara from a colleague who had read it online and mentioned it casually, the way people mention things they don't realize are grenades. Daniel said nothing. He thanked the colleague. He waited until he was alone. Then he sat very still and felt something that was not relief. It was not surprise either. It was concern. A specific, careful concern, the kind you feel when you know enough to understand that the thing everyone is celebrating as an answer is actually pointing in the wrong direction. And you know this. And you are the only one who knows this. And you have to decide, right now, what to do with that. He made a call that evening. Not to his father. Not to Gerald. Not to anyone connected to the investigation. He drove to a part of the city he rarely visited, a quieter neighborhood, older buildings, the kind of street that doesn't show up in real estate listings because the people who live there aren't selling. He parked. He walked to a specific building. He buzzed a specific apartment. A woman's voice answered. It's Daniel, he said. The door opened. She was waiting in the hallway outside her apartment door, older, 60s perhaps, composed in the way that people are composed when life has removed the option of falling apart. She had gray at her temples and careful eyes and the specific posture of someone who has been standing watch over something for a very long time. She looked at Daniel without surprise. They found Clara, Daniel said. I know, the woman said. Everyone thinks it's over. She looked at him steadily. I know that too. Daniel pressed his hands into his jacket pockets. Is she going to be okay? Clara, does she know what she's gotten herself into? The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that rearranged everything the audience thought they understood. Clara wasn't the one who wrote those letters, she said. The hallway went very still. Then who? Daniel started. But the woman's expression stopped him. Because she wasn't confused. She wasn't alarmed. She looked like someone who had always known this moment was coming and had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Everything you thought you knew just shifted. Leave your reaction in the comments. We want to know the exact moment something felt wrong to you. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there the moment Chapter 6 drops. The real story starts now. Her name wasn't Elena anymore. Not officially. She had been living under a different name for 11 years, a quiet name, an ordinary name, the kind that doesn't pull attention. She had a small apartment, a part-time job at a community library, neighbors who knew her as a woman who kept mostly to herself and watered her plants on Sunday mornings. She had built a life specifically designed not to be found. Daniel had found her anyway. She let him in without ceremony. The apartment was small and clean and careful, the kind of space that belongs to someone who has learned to need very little. A bookshelf. A table with 2 chairs. A window that looked onto a narrow street. On the bookshelf, among the books, a single photograph in a plain frame. Daniel had noticed it the first time he came here 2 years ago and had not mentioned it then. He noticed it again now and still didn't mention it. Elena, because that was still her name to anyone who had known her before, sat across from him at the table. She had made tea without asking if he wanted any. She set a cup in front of him. He hadn't touched it. "You need to tell me everything," Daniel said. "Not the version you've been carrying. All of it." Elena looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've been waiting for permission to put something down. She started talking. Lena had not known she was pregnant when the marriage ended. That was the first thing Elena said, and she said it plainly, without softening it, because there was no soft version. Lena had discovered the pregnancy 2 months after the separation, alone, in a bathroom in the smaller house she had moved into with Daniel, who was 9 years old at the time and had no idea any of this was happening 1 floor above him. Lena had called Elena. Not Richard. Not a lawyer. Elena. She was terrified, Elena said. Not of the pregnancy. Of him. Of what he would do with it. She had watched what he did with Daniel, how he kept Daniel just close enough to be useful and far enough away to be convenient. She wasn't going to let that happen to another child. So Lena had made a decision. She had the baby quietly, a private clinic, a small city 2 hours away, Elena by her side. A girl. Healthy. Lena held her for 4 hours. Then she asked Elena to take her. Elena's voice didn't break when she said this. She had told this story to herself enough times that the sharp edges had been worn down. But her hands tightened around her own cup, and that was enough. She said she would come back for her, Elena said. Once things were settled. Once she was sure Richard couldn't use the child as a legal instrument against her. She said 6 months. Maybe a year. But 6 months later, Lena got sick. And a year after that, the word dying entered the conversation. And Lena never came back. Not because she didn't want to. Because she ran out of time. Her name is Mara, Elena said. She said it the way you say the name of something precious. Not dramatically, just carefully. She's 23. She grew up here, in this city, 2 miles from where her mother died, and Lena never knew. I couldn't, Elena stopped. Collected herself. I couldn't find a way to tell her that was also kind. And then there was no more time to find a way. Daniel looked at the photograph on the bookshelf. A young woman, early 20s, not looking at the camera. Something about the photograph was familiar in a way he hadn't been able to name the first time he saw it. He thought he could name it now. She wrote the letters, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And Clara? Elena's expression changed, not anger exactly, but a controlled version of it. The kind of anger that has been managed for a long time. Clara was paid, Elena said. Someone found out that Mara was moving. That she was planning to surface. And someone arranged for another woman to step forward first, to claim to be the daughter, to create confusion, to make sure that if Mara ever spoke, there was already a story in the way. A messy story. A story that would make people doubt. Daniel sat very still. Who paid her? I don't know, Elena said. But I know it wasn't random. Whoever did it knew enough about the timeline, about Lena, about the adoption records, they knew things that only a small number of people could have known. She paused. Someone has been watching this for a long time. Waiting for Mara to make a move. The room was quiet. Someone had known about Mara. Had known she existed. Had positioned a false daughter ahead of her like a roadblock. Had been waiting, patiently, for years. That was not protection. That was strategy. Elena looked at Daniel directly then. The way she had been building toward it since he sat down. You knew she existed, Elena said. You've known for 2 years. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was just a fact, placed on the table between them like the cup of tea, there, unavoidable, waiting. Daniel didn't look away. Yes. Why didn't you tell him? A long pause. Because I wasn't sure he deserved to know, Daniel said. Elena held his gaze. She didn't tell him he was wrong. She didn't tell him he was right. She just looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had spent 23 years making impossible decisions about who deserved what, and understood the weight of that question better than anyone in the world. Richard received the DNA results that same evening. He was alone in his home office, the private one, no assistant, door closed. His lawyers had expedited the test. Clara had cooperated fully, which he had taken at the time as another sign of her sincerity. He opened the results. He read them once. Then again. Clara Voss was not his biological daughter. The test was definitive. No ambiguity, no margin of error, no room for a second opinion. Richard set the paper down on his desk. He sat in his chair in the quiet room and looked at it. Someone had sent a woman to his wedding to claim to be his child. Someone had provided her with documents, convincing enough documents that his lawyers, his PI, and Richard himself had believed them. Someone had known that the letters were coming. Had known enough to get a false claimant into position before anyone started looking. He had been managed. Carefully, deliberately, by someone who knew him well enough to predict exactly how he would respond. He picked up his phone. He called Gerald. The DNA came back, Richard said. Clara's not mine. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then who is? Richard looked at the results on his desk. At the proof of a lie that someone had built specifically to keep him looking in the wrong direction. I don't know, Richard said. But someone does. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment with a single photograph on a bookshelf, Elena poured the untouched tea down the sink and hoped she hadn't just run out of time. Elena kept this secret for 23 years to protect a child, and now someone else has been protecting a secret of their own. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the person behind Clara is still in this story. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there when Chapter 7 drops. The walls are closing in. Richard called Daniel at 7 in the morning and said 4 words. Come to the house. Not a question. Not an explanation. Daniel arrived 40 minutes later to find his father standing in the kitchen, not the formal sitting room, not the office, the kitchen, which told him something about the kind of conversation this was going to be. Richard had made coffee. There were 2 cups. He had been waiting. Daniel sat down. Richard sat across from him. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. How long? Richard said. Not do you know something. Not I need to ask you something. Just, how long? Daniel looked at his father's face. Richard wasn't angry. That was the thing that made it harder. He looked like a man who had already done the math and just needed someone to confirm the number. 2 years, Daniel said. Richard absorbed that. 2 years. He had spent 2 years sitting across from his son at quarterly dinners and Christmas and the occasional work event. 2 years of phone calls and brief conversations in corridors. 2 years of Daniel knowing something that rewrote the entire family's history, and saying nothing. You found her, Richard said. Yes. You met her. Yes. Richard picked up his coffee cup. Set it down without drinking. And you decided not to tell me. Yes, Daniel said. Then, because he owed his father more than single-word answers, because I wasn't sure you deserved to know. The kitchen was very quiet. That's honest, Richard said finally. I thought you'd prefer it to a lie. Daniel reached into his jacket and placed the second letter on the table between them. The one meant only for him, Mara's handwriting, his name at the top, no one else's. She sent me this before the wedding, Daniel said. She wanted me to know she was going to do it. She wasn't asking permission. She just wanted someone in that room to know who she was. Richard looked at the letter but didn't touch it. What does it say? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she asked one question. She said, did he ever ask about me? Even once? Richard said nothing. He didn't reach for the letter. He didn't look away from it either. He just sat with that question in the air between them, and the silence stretched out long enough that the answer became undeniable without anyone having to speak it. He had never asked. Because he had never known to ask. Because the people around him had made very sure of that. But Mara didn't know the second part. She only knew the first. And to a 23-year-old woman who had grown up without a father, the distinction between didn't know and didn't ask probably felt very thin. Richard put his hand flat on the table. Not on the letter. Just beside it. She thinks I chose not to find her, he said. Yes, Daniel said. She does. Daniel poured himself the coffee he hadn't touched yet. He was building toward something, and Richard could feel it, the careful pace of a person delivering bad news in the right order. There's more, Daniel said. I know. Someone knew about Mara before I did. Years before. Daniel set the cup down. Someone who was inside your marriage. Who knew Lena? Who knew the timeline, the pregnancy, Elena, all of it? Richard went still. That same person arranged for Clara, Daniel continued. Not recently. It was a contingency plan. If Mara ever surfaced, Clara was already in position. Ready to step forward, muddy the story, make it impossible to know which woman was real. He paused. Clara didn't do this for money she found last month. She'd been on a retainer for years. Waiting for a phone call that would tell her it was time. Richard looked at his son. Years. Years, Daniel confirmed. Someone in my company. Someone close to your company, Daniel said carefully. Someone who knew enough about Lena's history to know what to suppress. Someone who had access to resources, enough to maintain a contingency, enough to keep Elena quiet, enough to make sure the adoption record stayed sealed past the point where anyone would normally look. Richard was already moving through the list. He had a habit of doing this, a mental inventory, practiced over decades of identifying threats before they became crises. He ran through the names of people who had been present for all of it. The marriage. The divorce. The years before and after. People who knew Lena. People who were still, today, connected to the Hale organization. The list was not long. And at the top of it, with a clarity that arrived not as suspicion but as recognition, the way you recognize something you have always known but never examined, was a name. Harlan Moore. 61 years old. 30 years on Richard's board. The man who had known Richard since before the first company, before the money, before any of this. The man who had known Lena. The man who, on the day of the wedding, had walked through a room full of frozen, silent guests and placed a letter directly in Richard's hand and said, "You need to read this." Richard had taken that as loyalty. As friendship. As Harlan doing what he had always done, being the person who dealt with the problem directly, who didn't flinch, who stood beside Richard in the hard moments. But standing beside someone and guiding them toward a specific conclusion are two very different things. And Harlan had put that letter in his hand. Had been the first person to reach him. Had framed the entire event, from the very first moment, as something Richard needed to know about, needed to investigate, needed to chase. And the chase had led directly to Clara. Which was exactly where someone wanted him to go. Richard felt the full weight of 30 years rearrange itself. "Harlan," he said. Not a question. Daniel looked at him. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. He just watched his father arrive at the only name that fit, and he stayed quiet, the way you stay quiet when the person next to you needs a moment to absorb something that cannot be unabsorbed. Richard stood up slowly. He walked to the window. He looked at nothing in particular. 30 years. The man he had trusted with everything. The man who had stood at his wedding, his first wedding, with Lena, as a witness. The man who had signed his name to things that mattered. The man who had walked toward him at the altar and handed him a letter with the steady hands of someone who already knew exactly what was inside it. Harlan handed him that letter on purpose. He knew what it said. He'd known for 30 years. Let that sit with you, then leave your reaction in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there for Chapter 8. This is the chapter where everything breaks open. Richard called Harlan that same afternoon. He didn't send a lawyer. He didn't send Gerald. He called the man directly, and when Harlan answered, Richard said, "I know. Come and tell me yourself." A long pause on the line. "All right," Harlan said. He arrived within the hour. He looked the same as he always looked, 61, composed, the kind of man who has learned to carry weight without showing it in his posture. He came in without being shown to a room. He had been in this house enough times to know where to go. They sat in the private office. The door closed. No lawyers. No witnesses. Just 30 years of friendship and everything that had been built on top of a secret. Harlan didn't wait to be accused. He sat down and he started talking, and Richard let him, because the truth was that he needed to hear it in the right order. He needed to understand how a man he had trusted completely had spent 23 years holding a piece of his life without telling him. "I knew Lena before you did," Harlan said. "You know that. We all moved in the same circles back then." Richard nodded. This was not new. When she came to me, when she told me about the pregnancy, she wasn't asking me to make a decision. She was asking me to help her carry one she'd already made. Harlan looked at his hands. "She was afraid of you, Richard. Not of you personally. Of what you would do. You were in the middle of building everything. You were ruthless about it, you know you were. She had watched you use Daniel in the custody arrangements to protect your own position. She wasn't going to let that happen again." Richard said nothing. He did not deny it. "She wanted to disappear," Harlan continued. "Have the baby quietly, let her sister raise the child, come back for her when things were stable. When she was sure the child was safe from the machinery of all of this. He gestured vaguely at the office, the house, the empire it represented. She asked me to arrange it. To help her get Elena set up without leaving a trail. And you did, Richard said. Yes. Because you loved her. Harlan looked up. The question landed somewhere specific, and he didn't try to redirect it. I had known her a long time, he said carefully. Yes. The room was very quiet after that. Outside, somewhere in the city, a woman named Mara was living her life without knowing this conversation was happening. 23 years of carefully maintained silence, and it was all coming apart in an afternoon. She was supposed to go back for her, Harlan said. That was always the plan. 6 months. A year at most. She said she just needed time to stabilize things, to make sure the legal situation couldn't be used against her. He paused. And then she got sick. He said it plainly. Not as an excuse. Just as a fact that had arrived and destroyed everything that came after it. Once she was sick, there was no right time to fix it, Harlan continued. She didn't want Mara to know her as a dying woman. She kept saying she would tell her when she was better. And then better stopped being a possibility, and he stopped. Pressed his hands together. She died with it unresolved. She didn't get to change her mind. She didn't get to go back. Richard absorbed this in silence. Lena had spent her final years carrying the knowledge that she had a daughter she couldn't reach. A daughter who didn't know her name. And she had died with that. The grief of it was different from any grief Richard had felt before, not for himself, not yet, but for Lena. For what she had lived with alone. For the decision she had made out of fear, a fear of him, specifically, and what it had cost her in the years she was running out of. And when Mara surfaced, Richard said slowly. You panicked. Yes. Not to protect me. Harlan looked at him directly. No. Not to protect you. To protect her choice. Lena's. It wasn't my decision to give away anymore, Harlan said. But I didn't know how to undo it either. Mara was moving, making plans, building toward something. And I arranged Clara because I needed time. I needed to think. I told myself I was buying time to find the right answer. Was there a right answer? Richard asked. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. There wasn't. There was only the answer Lena would have eventually chosen. And I didn't have the right to make that choice for her anymore. I just couldn't figure out how to stop. Richard stood up. He walked to the window, the same window he had stood at when Daniel told him about Mara, 2 days ago, which felt like a lifetime. He looked at the city below and thought about a woman who had been afraid of him. Who had made an enormous, painful decision because she thought it was the only way to keep a child safe from him. Who had spent her remaining years unable to go back. He thought about the fear. He thought about whether it had been fair. He thought about Daniel at 9 years old, used as a legal instrument in a custody arrangement, which was true, which had happened, which he had told himself was strategy at the time and had never once reconsidered. He didn't say any of this to Harlan. Some reckonings are private. Where is she? Richard said. He was still facing the window. Mara. Where is she now? Harlan shook his head. I don't know. After Clara fell apart, I lost the thread. She's careful. She doesn't want to be found. Richard turned. Does Daniel know? A pause. Harlan said nothing. Which meant yes. Richard walked to the door and opened it. Harlan stood. He looked like a man who had expected punishment and received something worse, understanding. Which left him with nowhere to put what he was carrying. I'll need your resignation, Richard said. Quietly. With a proper transition. Harlan nodded. He had known this was coming. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he stopped. He turned back, just once. She was trying to protect her, he said. Lena. That was all it ever was. I know, Richard said. That's the part one have to live with. Daniel came an hour later. He found his father sitting at the desk, not working, just sitting. Present in the room in a way he hadn't been in years. Like something had been removed that had been taking up space. Does she know I exist? Richard asked. Mara. Does she know my name? Yes, Daniel said. She looked you up. She knows everything public about you. Does she want to meet me? Daniel was quiet for a moment. No. Not right now. Richard nodded slowly. He had expected this and still felt it land. But she left something, Daniel said. He reached into his bag and placed it on the desk. A piece of paper, not a copy, the original, worn at the folds in the way things get worn when they've been kept for a long time. A child's drawing. Crayon. A figure in a dark suit, tall, slightly lopsided the way all figures are when a small child draws them. A city behind him, suggested rather than detailed, the way children suggest things they're not sure how to name. At the bottom, in careful crayon letters, the handwriting of a 3-year-old doing their best, a name. Not his name. She hadn't known his name. The tall man in Mother's photograph. Richard sat looking at it for a very long time. He had not known she existed. She had not known his name. And somewhere in between those two facts, 20 years had passed, and a child had drawn a picture of a stranger in a suit and kept it. Had carried it into adulthood. Had eventually placed it in an envelope and asked Daniel to deliver it. Not as an accusation. Not as evidence. Just as proof that she had wondered about him too. A crayon drawing. 20 years old. That's what 23 years of silence looks like when it finally arrives. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to know what you felt when you read that last part. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're there for Chapter 9. There's one more truth left, and it's the one nobody has been asking about. Daniel had chosen a cafe. Not a private room, not a hotel, not anywhere that felt like a negotiation. Just a regular cafe in a quiet part of the city, the kind of place where no one pays attention to anyone else because everyone is too focused on their own conversation. He arrived first. He ordered 2 coffees without knowing what she drank, then sat there looking at the second cup and wondering if that had been presumptuous. She arrived 7 minutes late. Dark coat. The same one from the security footage, though he hadn't been sure until now. She looked like someone who had decided, before walking through the door, exactly how much of herself she was willing to give this meeting. She sat down. She looked at the second cup. "Thank you," she said. She wrapped both hands around it but didn't drink. Mara was not what he had prepared himself for. Daniel had built a version of her in his mind over 2 years, the version constructed from Elena's descriptions, from the second letter, from the security footage of a young woman placing envelopes on chairs with the steady hands of someone who has already made peace with a decision. He had expected intensity. Controlled anger. The kind of composure that has fury underneath it. What he found was something quieter than that. She was careful. There's a difference between careful and cold, and Mara was not cold. She was the way a person is when they have thought about something from every angle for a very long time, not detached, but precise. She said what she meant. She didn't fill silences she hadn't caused. "You came," Daniel said. "You asked honestly," she said. "Your letter didn't feel like a trap." A pause. Most things feel like traps. He didn't push her. He just let the conversation find its own pace, which was slower than he expected and more careful than most conversations he had. At some point, after the coffee had cooled, after they had gotten through the surface layer of who she was and where she had been, Daniel asked the question he had been holding for 2 years. Why the wedding? Why that moment? Mara looked at the table. When she looked up, her expression was not dramatic. It was just honest. "Because I was leaving," she said. "I had a flight booked. A new city. A new name, not legally, just practically. I was going to start over and stop waiting for something that was never going to happen on its own." She paused. "I had been waiting to matter to someone in that family for 23 years. And I was done. So the letters were. Goodbye," she said simply. "I wanted him to know I had existed. I wasn't going to ask him for anything. I just didn't want to disappear like I had never been there at all." Daniel sat with that. She had not written those letters to destroy anything. She had not planned the collapsed wedding, the photographs, the legal standoff, the investigation. She had written 84 goodbyes and walked out of the building and gotten on with the business of letting go. The chaos that followed, Clara, the DNA test, Catherine leaving, Harlan's resignation, all of it, none of that was what Mara had intended. She had expected Richard to read, feel something briefly, and return to his life. She had expected to be an unanswered question he carried quietly and never pursued. She had expected to be, as she had always been, not quite real enough to act on. "You didn't think he'd look for you," Daniel said. "No," she said. "I didn't think I was worth the trouble." She said it without self-pity. Just as a fact she had arrived at through years of evidence. That landed somewhere in Daniel that he didn't have words for. He asked about the handwriting. He had been wondering since Patricia said it at the wedding, since the whole room went quiet around a detail that felt like it had been designed to wound. He needed to know if it was deliberate. "Elena taught me how to write," Mara said. She was very particular about it. Proper grip, proper form, slow and careful. She said it was important to write like you meant it. A small pause. "I didn't know it was anything until people recognized it. I just write how I was taught." Daniel stared at her. The handwriting that had stopped a room full of people. That Patricia had recognized from 20 feet away. That had sent them all down a road of grief and memory and something that felt like a message from Lena herself. It was simply inheritance. Elena had learned from Lena. Elena had taught Mara. And Mara had carried it forward without ever knowing she was carrying it. It was never a signal. It was never a code. It was just the way a woman's handwriting moves through the people she loves, long after she is gone. The cafe was quieter now. The lunch crowd had thinned. Mara turned her cup slowly in her hands, and Daniel watched her work up to something. He could see it the way you see weather arriving from a distance. Was she happy? Mara asked. She said it looking at the table, then looked up. My mother. Before she got sick. Was there any time, was she happy? Daniel opened his mouth. And stopped. He thought about his mother. He thought about the smaller house, the teachers' conferences she attended alone, the dinners she made and left in the refrigerator. He thought about the Sunday mornings when she used to sit at the kitchen table with a book and look out the window with an expression he hadn't known how to read as a child and understood much better now. He thought about whether that had been happiness. Or something else. Something quieter. Something that looked like happiness from the right angle but was really just the piece of a woman who had decided to stop waiting for more. He couldn't answer quickly. He wanted to give her something real. And the real answer was complicated, and he was still working out what it was, and the seconds stretched. Mara watched him not answer. And somehow, in that pause, in the time it took Daniel to reach for something true, she understood more about her mother's life than any sentence could have told her. Her eyes didn't fill. She didn't look away. She just sat with it, the way she sat with everything, carefully, as if it were something she had agreed to carry. The door opened. Daniel had not told her he was coming. He had told himself he wouldn't. He had made that decision and unmade it 3 times on the drive over, and in the end he had sent a message from the parking lot because he couldn't make himself not. Richard Hale walked into the cafe. He looked the way he had looked in that side room on the day of the wedding, not collapsed, but no longer held together by the old architecture either. Something had shifted in him over the past 2 weeks that hadn't shifted back. He saw her immediately. Mara saw him at the same moment. Her body went very still. The careful composure she had carried through the entire conversation didn't break, but it changed. It became something different. Something that was working harder. She reached for her coat. Daniel said, quietly, Mara. She stood. She picked up her coat and held it in front of her and looked toward the door, and Richard was standing between her and the door, and for a moment no one moved. Then Richard said her name. Just that. Just Mara. For the first time in his life, in a voice that had spent 37 years commanding rooms and never once, not once, spoken that particular syllable. She stopped. Her hand tightened on her coat. She did not turn around. But she stopped. She stopped. That's where we are. Tell us in the comments what you think she's feeling in that moment. We want to know. Subscribe and turn on notifications because Chapter 10, the final chapter, is everything this story has been building toward. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood with her coat in her hands and her back to the room, and the cafe was very quiet around that stillness. Daniel didn't move. Richard didn't move. The word he had said, her name, just her name, hung in the air between them like something that had been waiting a very long time to be spoken and didn't know what came next. Then Mara turned around. She looked at her father. He looked at her. And neither of them said anything for a moment that was long enough to contain 23 years and not nearly long enough to explain them. They sat down. Not because it felt natural, nothing about this felt natural, but because standing made it feel more like a confrontation, and neither of them wanted that. Daniel moved to a table nearby, close enough to be present, far enough to give them the only privacy the moment allowed. Richard looked at Mara the way a person looks at something they have been told about for years but are only now seeing with their own eyes. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't perform emotion. He just looked, with the particular attention of a man who understood, in this moment, how much he had lost by not knowing sooner. I would have looked for you, he said. If I had known. Mara held his gaze. I know. He waited, because there was more in her voice, the particular weight of a sentence that isn't finished yet. That's the part I'm still deciding how to feel about, she said. Richard nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't say but I didn't know again, because she had already said she knew, and repeating it would have been for his comfort, not hers. And she had not come to this table to make him comfortable. They sat together for 40 minutes. It was not easy. It was not warm, not yet. Warmth is something that has to be built from smaller things, repeated over time, and they had none of that history yet. But it was real. 2 people in a cafe, speaking carefully, neither of them pretending the 40 minutes could repair what 23 years had done. When Mara stood to leave, Richard stood too. He didn't ask for a next time. He didn't ask for anything. She picked up her coat. I don't know what this becomes, she said. I'm not making any promises. I'm not asking for any, Richard said. She left. Richard sat back down and stayed there for a long time, long after his coffee was cold, long after Daniel had quietly come back to the table and sat beside him without speaking. The two of them just sat in the ordinary cafe in the ordinary city, and the afternoon moved around them. Harlan's resignation was submitted the following week. Quiet, as Richard had asked. A proper transition, a handover of responsibilities, a statement that said nothing while saying everything to anyone who knew how to read between the lines of a corporate departure. But before he left, Harlan wrote a letter. Not to Richard. Not to the board. To Mara. It was not an apology. He had thought about whether to make it one and decided against it, because an apology would have made it about him, about his guilt, about his need for her to forgive something she had not asked to carry. Instead it was an account. Careful, detailed, honest. Everything he knew about Lena, not the version that appeared in an obituary or a family memory, but the real version. The woman who had laughed at things that weren't supposed to be funny. The way she organized her bookshelves by color, which drove everyone around her slightly mad. The particular expression she wore when she was making a decision she knew was hard but had already made. The last time Harlan had seen her, 2 months before she died, when she had held his hand and said, "Make sure Elena knows I'm grateful." He wrote it all down. Every detail he had. He gave her what he could, her mother's life, told by someone who had loved her from a distance and protected that love poorly. Mara read it twice. She put it in a drawer. She didn't respond. She was not obligated to, and she didn't pretend otherwise. But she kept it. Daniel sent Mara a message 2 weeks after the cafe. Not about their father. Not about any of it. He asked if she had read a particular book, one he had mentioned briefly during their conversation, that she had said she hadn't gotten to yet. She hadn't. He sent her his copy. She read it in 4 days, which is fast for someone who claims not to have time. She messaged him about a specific passage on page 81 that she disagreed with. He disagreed with her disagreement. She disagreed back. That was how it started. Slowly. Carefully. Like two people learning a language they were both slightly embarrassed not to already know. They didn't talk about their father often. When they did, it was briefly, and they moved on quickly. There was too much else to figure out first, who they were to each other outside of what had been done to both of them. That part was newer and more fragile, and they both seemed to understand it needed protecting. Richard did not call Catherine. He had told himself he wouldn't, and for once he kept the promise he made to himself. The engagement was over. He accepted this in the way he accepted things that couldn't be changed, not easily, not without cost, but without pretending the cost wasn't real. Catherine had asked him a direct question and he had answered honestly. The problem was that honest had not been enough, because honest had not been complete. And she had known that before he had. He gave himself no particular timeline for what came next. For the first time in 37 years, he had no project in motion, no objective to optimize, no crisis to manage. The house was very quiet. He found that he didn't know what to do with quiet. He had been filling space for so long that silence felt like a room with all the furniture removed. He started going for walks in the morning. Nothing productive. Just walks. He came back. He made breakfast. He sat at the table and looked out the window and thought about a woman named Lena who had been afraid of him, and whether that fear had been fair, and what a person is supposed to do with the answer to that question. He didn't figure it out. He kept asking it anyway. He went to see Elena. He found the address through Daniel, who gave it without comment. He drove there himself, no assistant, no advance call. He buzzed the apartment. The intercom was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she did. He went up. Elena opened the door and looked at him the way she had probably spent 23 years imagining she would look at him, with the clear, leveled gaze of a woman who has decided in advance not to give anything away for free. Richard stood in the doorway. "I came to thank you," he said. "For what you did for her. For both of them." Elena said nothing. "I know that's not enough," he said. "I'm not here because I think it is." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. She didn't smile. She didn't offer tea. She didn't make it easy, because she was not obligated to make it easy, and she had made her peace with that fact long before today. But she stepped back from the door. He went inside. The drawing came back in an envelope 3 days later. Mara recognized his handwriting on the outside. She had seen it in a document once, a signature on something public, and had memorized it the way you memorize things you've been reaching toward for a long time. Inside was the child's drawing. Her drawing. The tall man in the dark suit, the crayon city behind him, the careful letters at the bottom that had taken her a long time to get right when she was 3 years old. There was a single note with it. "You should have this. You made it." Mara sat at her kitchen table and looked at the drawing for a long time. She looked at the figure she had drawn, lopsided, approximate, nothing like accurate, and thought about the child she had been when she made it. The child who had seen a photograph on a shelf and asked Elena, "Who is that?" And Elena had said, "Someone your mother knew." And the child had drawn him anyway, the way children draw the things they want to understand. She thought about what it meant that he had sent it back. That he hadn't kept it. That he had understood, somehow, that it belonged to her, that it was a record of her wondering, her reaching, her long years of not knowing, and that he had no right to hold on to it. She got up. She went to the bookshelf. She moved 2 books aside and placed the drawing behind them, against the back panel, where it would stay flat and undamaged. Then she went to make tea. Outside the window, the city continued on the way cities do, indifferent, unhurried, full of people carrying things no one else can see. Mara stood at the window while the kettle heated and looked out at it, and she was not happy exactly, and she was not healed exactly, but she was still here. Still in this city. Still, for now, not leaving. The letters had been goodbye. As it turned out, they were also the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. She was in no rush to name it. This story ends the way real things end, not with everything fixed, but with something true. If this series meant something to you, tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories that go this deep, subscribe and stay with us. There's always another story worth telling.